in 1500 to 1750, so the early modern period. So the first thing to recognise when we're talking about epidemics, that the outbreak of the plague continued in the early modern period. We know in the medieval period we talk about the Black Death. In this time period we call it the plague. It is the same kind of epidemic, just got a different name. Okay, and the most serious outbreak of the plague we see is in 1665, and at that point it's called the Great Plague. Now the plague's terrifying because of its frequency, the symptoms associated with it, and the fact that nobody understood what caused it, and so many people died. Okay. Now, in terms of the continuity, there's a lot of continuity between what we see in the early modern period with the medieval period, and that starts with people's beliefs about the causes of the plague. There's still a belief in miasma, that it's the bad air theory, and they thought that this is the bad smells in the air was what caused the plague. There was still absolutely belief that this was a punishment from God, that the disease was God's punishment for sin. Okay. However, the one change we see is that it's towards the end of this time period that scientists begin to think that close contact with an infected person may be a cause of the disease spreading. And we see, as alongside that, the other change is the first example of national policy for health, and through the plague orders that are put in place to respond to this epidemic. Okay. So we're going to go on to look at those national responses to the plague, and they start in 1518. And in 1518, we see Henry VIII's royal proclamation, his order that houses infected with the plague in London should be identified and isolated. And we know that people had to hang bundles of straw from their windows for 40 days, and people who left their house had to carry a white stick. So this was to warn others to avoid them in the streets. And isolation becomes the main method of plague prevention for the next 150 years. Okay, and as we said, this is the first real involvement of national government in England's public health, and it made mayors and aldermen in all England's towns take action when the plague struck. Okay, now this is built upon and the next big step that we see in 1578. Okay, so in 1578, as we know, the plague keeps coming back and keeps returning. Elizabeth I, Queen of the time, orders the printing of plague orders. So they use the printing press, which had become an important weapon, if you like, an important tool in the government's battle to improve public health. And the plague orders are printed in 1578 and sent out to justices of the peace and aldermen across England. And it told them how to enforce orders at times of the plague. Okay, and these summaries of the plague orders are stuck on doors and posts for people to read. And just some examples of the things that were said to people in terms of what they had to do. And they were all around kind of recording the spreading of the disease, providing financial help for the sick. We know that the clothes of victims and their bedding had to be burnt. And plague sufferers and the healthy who lived in the same house were quarantined, isolated away from others for at least 6 weeks, and special prayers were said for God's forgiveness. We know as well from all the other things that streets and alleys had to be cleaned, tar barrels should be burnt in the streets, and no cats or tame dogs or tame pigeons should be allowed on the streets. And as we said, infected houses in towns should be shut for up to 6 weeks. Okay, and all members of the family, sick or healthy, had to stay inside. And watchmen were appointed to enforce these orders, and these orders remained in place from 1578 to 1667. Okay. Now there was some update to dealing with the plague in 1604, and Parliament passes a new law called the Plague Act. And what that act did was allow towns to collect money from nearby parishes, and if necessary, more could be raised from the whole country. And it also introduced harsh punishments. So plague victims who left their house and mixed with other people could be hanged, and any healthy person who left an infected house could be whipped. Okay, so these, what we're seeing here, are still kind of laws and orders that follow the beliefs and attitudes of the time around the cause of the plague, so miasma, bad air, and relying still on God. And then by the 17th century, most towns in England knew how to respond to the plague. So we still got that process of isolation, and many towns built what were called pest houses outside the town wall, so plague victims could be isolated there. All right, and we see in terms of locally, a lot of different towns that have been good examples of measures to kind of again deal with the plague. And if we just have a look at a couple here, this idea of isolation is a reoccurring theme. So in Eyam, a village in the Peak District, the whole village quarantined itself in 1665 to stop the spread of the disease to Sheffield. Now, the consequence of that was that actually, although Sheffield was safe, 75% of the people of Eyam died. In Cambridge, another example, Cambridge tried to put in place a lot of different measures to deal with and prepare for the arrival of the plague, and one of those things was to clean the streets, to get rid of stray cats and dogs. They put, again, victims of the plague moved to pest houses, and anybody who wanted to come into Cambridge had to have a health certificate. So they were only allowed into Cambridge if they could prove that they were healthy. Okay. And then on an individual perspective, which is our last kind of response to the plague, we see, again, some similarities to what we saw in the medieval period, that people are still going to church, okay, as we know, nearly everybody believed in God, so praying that God would take away the plague was part of that response. We again see people running away, okay, so it was the rich who left infected towns, but most people had to stay on deal with the disease the best they could. And again, we've got people trying to find cures and all sorts of cures, and this image of the plague doctor is one that'll be familiar to you, who used sweet-smelling posies to try and fight against the miasma, what they thought was the cause of the plague. Avoidance of the sick, and people kind of sticking together. So people didn't abandon their families; they stayed together and prayed and hoped that they would survive. Again, linking back to the beliefs and attitudes of the time.